World War I, also known as the Great War, was one of the deadliest and most transformative conflicts in modern history. It began in the summer of 1914 and lasted until 1918, reshaping the political, social, and economic landscape of Europe and the world. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives, and the consequences of this war are still felt today. To understand why this global conflict erupted, we must examine the tensions that had been building in Europe for decades. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the major powers were deeply entangled in complex alliances, militarization, and imperial competition. The desire for national prestige, combined with economic rivalries, created an environment where even a small incident could spark a continent-wide war. By 1914, Europe was dominated by two major alliance systems. On one side stood the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other side, the Triple Entente included France, Russia, and Great Britain. These alliances were meant to preserve peace by deterring attacks, but they also meant that any conflict involving one nation could quickly escalate into a much larger war. Nationalism further heightened tensions. In multi-ethnic empires such as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, nationalist movements sought independence or greater influence. In the Balkans, for example, Slavic nationalist groups resisted Austro-Hungarian control, creating instability that drew the attention of the great powers. Imperialism also played a crucial role. European powers competed for colonies in Africa and Asia, seeking resources and global influence. This rivalry contributed to an arms race, with nations investing heavily in modern weapons and military infrastructure. The result was a continent ready for war, with tensions at a breaking point. The immediate trigger came on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and issued a strict ultimatum. When Serbia did not fully comply, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. The alliance system quickly turned this regional conflict into a world war. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia, prompting Germany to declare war on Russia. Germany then declared war on France, and when German troops invaded neutral Belgium, Great Britain entered the war. Within weeks, most of Europe was engulfed in conflict, and nations around the world were drawn in through colonial ties. The war was not caused by a single event, but by a series of interconnected factors: complex alliances, nationalist fervor, imperial rivalries, military buildup, and political miscalculations. These forces had been developing for decades, and in 1914, they erupted into a global conflict that would change history forever. By the time the first battles began, Europe was a tinderbox. Soldiers marched to war believing in honor, duty, and patriotism, yet few could have imagined the scale of destruction that lay ahead. Cities would burn, millions of lives would be lost, and the world order would be transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. Understanding the causes of World War I is essential to understanding the 20th century. The war set the stage for revolutionary political changes, the rise and fall of empires, and the social transformations that followed. By studying this history, we can better grasp why conflicts escalate and the importance of diplomacy, negotiation, and caution in international relations. As July 1914 turned into August, Europe was rapidly descending into war. The declaration by Austria-Hungary against Serbia triggered a cascade of mobilizations and counter-declarations. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia, and Germany responded by declaring war on Russia. Soon, Germany declared war on France and invaded neutral Belgium, prompting Britain to enter the conflict. Within weeks, the continent was engulfed in a full-scale war that would last for years. The war quickly became a battle on multiple fronts. In Western Europe, Germany and France faced each other across heavily fortified trench systems. These trenches stretched for hundreds of miles and were filled with mud, barbed wire, and the constant threat of artillery bombardment. Soldiers faced unbearable conditions, rain, disease, and the constant fear of attack. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Germany and Austria-Hungary clashed with Russia in vast expanses of land. Unlike the heavily fortified Western Front, battles in the East involved rapid troop movements, encirclements, and large-scale offensives. The harsh winters and difficult terrain added to the suffering of soldiers and civilians alike. Technology played a devastating role. The use of machine guns, heavy artillery, and early tanks transformed the nature of warfare. Airplanes used for reconnaissance and dogfights added a new dimension to the battlefield. Chemical weapons, such as mustard gas, introduced horrors that had never been seen before in human history. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers experienced extreme stress, fatigue, and trauma. The concept of trench foot, shell shock, and other war-related injuries became widespread. Letters from home were a lifeline, yet they could not alleviate the fear and uncertainty faced daily. Naval warfare and blockades also played a key role. The British Royal Navy enforced a blockade against Germany, aiming to cut off supplies and weaken the Central Powers. In response, Germany used submarines or U-boats to attack commercial and military vessels, expanding the war into the seas and affecting global trade. By the end of 1914, Europe was locked in a stalemate. The hopes of a short war had vanished. Soldiers in the trenches faced unimaginable hardships, while commanders struggled to adapt to modern industrial warfare. The scale, technology, and brutality of the conflict were unlike anything the world had seen before, setting the stage for years of prolonged fighting and immense human suffering. After the initial battles, the war quickly settled into a deadly pattern of trench warfare. Soldiers lived in narrow, muddy trenches for weeks, sometimes months, facing constant danger from enemy fire, artillery, and poison gas. These conditions were harsh and unrelenting, testing the endurance and spirit of men from all nations involved. Daily life in the trenches was grueling. Soldiers endured cold, wet conditions and struggled to keep themselves and their equipment clean. Diseases such as trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet and unsanitary conditions, were common. Food was limited and often consisted of canned goods, hard biscuits, and whatever could be delivered through supply lines. Despite the hardships, soldiers found ways to maintain morale. They wrote letters to family members, shared stories with comrades, and celebrated small victories when possible. Humor, camaraderie, and rituals became essential for mental survival in an environment dominated by fear and uncertainty. Medical care in the trenches was limited but vital. Field hospitals were often close to the front lines, where medics treated wounds, infections, and the effects of chemical weapons. The introduction of new technologies and tactics forced medical staff to adapt quickly to unprecedented numbers of casualties. Communication was another challenge. Soldiers used signal flags, runners, and telephones where possible to coordinate attacks and relay information. Miscommunication or delay could result in disastrous consequences on the battlefield. The psychological strain of trench warfare was immense. Continuous bombardment, witnessing the deaths of friends, and the constant threat of attack led to shell shock, a term used to describe the emotional trauma suffered by soldiers. Many struggled with fear, anxiety, and fatigue that lasted long after leaving the front lines. Trenches were also strategically constructed. Frontline, support, and reserve trenches were connected by communication trenches to allow movement of troops and supplies. Barbed wire and sandbags were used to strengthen defenses, and lookout posts were constantly manned to detect enemy activity. This intricate system turned battlefields into complex networks of survival and deadly engagement. Although the war brought immense suffering, it also revealed remarkable resilience. Soldiers from diverse backgrounds endured the hardships together, forming bonds that would last a lifetime. Their experiences in the trenches would shape the understanding of modern warfare and leave a lasting mark on history. As 1915 and 1916 progressed, the war became more industrialized and deadly. Battles like the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun in Western Europe showcased the staggering scale of modern warfare. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in weeks, demonstrating how traditional tactics were inadequate against machine guns, artillery, and entrenched positions. The Western Front remained largely a stalemate, with both sides heavily fortified in long lines of trenches. Offensives were planned with careful coordination of artillery, infantry, and newly developed tanks. Yet, even with planning, advances were measured in meters, and casualties were extremely high. The term "no man's land" became synonymous with the horrific spaces between opposing trenches, often littered with barbed wire and the bodies of fallen soldiers. On the Eastern Front, mobility played a larger role. German and Austro-Hungarian forces faced Russian armies over vast territories, leading to encirclements and rapid offensives. The harsh winter, long supply lines, and difficult terrain challenged both soldiers and commanders, but the battles in the East often saw larger movements compared to the static Western Front. New technologies changed strategy. Tanks, first used in 1916, provided some advantage in crossing trenches and breaking through fortified positions. Poison gas, airplanes for reconnaissance, and improved artillery coordination forced generals to rethink traditional strategies. The war became a deadly combination of attrition and technological innovation. The human cost was immense. Soldiers endured constant bombardment, mud, cold, and the psychological toll of seeing comrades fall. Casualty lists grew daily, and the industrial scale of war blurred the line between victory and survival. Commanders and soldiers alike had to adapt to a type of warfare that no previous generation had experienced. Strategically, nations began to coordinate on a global scale. Naval blockades, supply chains, and alliances beyond Europe meant that the war impacted populations and economies worldwide. The conflict was no longer confined to Europe. Colonial troops and resources from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East played crucial roles in sustaining the war effort. By the end of 1916, the war had fundamentally changed. The initial belief in a short, glorious conflict was gone. Armies had learned the harsh realities of industrial warfare, and nations began to prepare for a prolonged struggle. The battles of these years left indelible marks on military strategy, technology, and the psyche of those who fought and survived. By 1918, the war had reached a tipping point. The Central Powers, exhausted and facing internal unrest, began to collapse. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire could no longer sustain their armies, and a series of armistices were signed, ending active combat. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, formally ended the war with Germany. The treaty imposed severe reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions on Germany, aiming to prevent future aggression. Other treaties similarly redrew borders across Europe and the Middle East, dissolving empires and creating new nations. The human cost of the war was staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died, and countless others were wounded or displaced. Cities, towns, and villages across Europe lay in ruins, and entire economies were shattered. The war's devastation prompted a focus on rebuilding and rethinking international relations. Returning soldiers faced challenges reintegrating into civilian life. Many carried physical injuries, while others struggled with psychological trauma, often referred to as shell shock. Governments and societies had to address the needs of these veterans, while also rebuilding infrastructure and economies. The end of the war also set the stage for international organizations aimed at preventing future conflicts. The League of Nations was established to promote diplomacy, cooperation, and conflict resolution on a global scale, although it faced limitations in its effectiveness. Despite the treaties and agreements, the consequences of the war were far-reaching. Political instability, economic hardship, and social unrest continued to affect Europe and the wider world. The lessons learned from World War I would shape the strategies, diplomacy, and conflicts of the 20th century. World War I left a profound legacy that shaped the 20th century. The collapse of empires such as Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German led to the creation of new nations and borders. These changes caused political instability and set the stage for future conflicts. Economically, Europe was devastated. Industries were destroyed, trade disrupted, and countries faced massive debts. Reconstruction efforts were slow, and the economic strain contributed to political unrest and social movements seeking change. Socially, the war transformed societies. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to replace men who had gone to fight. Cultural movements emerged that reflected the trauma and disillusionment of a generation that had witnessed unprecedented violence. The psychological impact of the war was also significant. Millions of veterans struggled with lasting trauma, including shell shock and post-war depression. Communities had to cope with the loss of a generation, creating a sense of grief and urgency for social and political reform. Internationally, the war demonstrated the need for diplomacy and cooperation. Institutions such as the League of Nations were created to prevent future conflicts, laying the groundwork for modern international organizations. Although the League ultimately failed to prevent another world war, it represented the first major attempt at collective security. World War I also left a lasting impact on military strategy and technology. The use of industrial-scale warfare, combined arms tactics, and innovations in aviation, artillery, and chemical weapons influenced how future wars would be fought. Generals and military theorists studied the lessons of World War I for decades afterward. In summary, the legacy of World War I is seen in the political boundaries, social transformations, and lessons learned about diplomacy, war, and human resilience. Understanding these consequences is essential to appreciating how the 20th century was shaped and why the world continues to reflect the outcomes of this monumental conflict.